emergency funds and why do we need to plan and make them happen as part of your portfolio strategy. That's exactly what we're going to look at in today's episode. Emergencies and the financial burden that they come with are rarely foreseen. Extremely important, therefore, for any of us to make sure that any emergency that occurs to you or your family is provided for well in advance so that it doesn't derail your financial plan journey. Let me explain. An uninsured illness can set you back substantially through hospitalization expenses in today's world. It's therefore important that you have provided for some sort of an emergency funding to help you manage that. Typically, emergencies can be divided into two parts. One is a short-term emergency and the other is a long-term. The short-term emergency could be something like what we faced recently in Chennai. You could have a flash flood because of which your home could have suffered some damage which you need to replace. These are temporary in nature, they're not predictable, but it needs to be provided for. Similarly, there could be instances of theft. You could have a health problem, temporary health issue, needing some form of hospitalization. All of these are in the form of a short-term nature of emergencies, and they need to be provided for. What are long-term emergencies? A prolonged break from work, if you're off work for some reason or the other, or an illness that is not insured and which is more prolonged in nature, maybe treatment for some of the critical illnesses, could be one more reason. You could have a larger expense due to a natural calamity because of which you need to reconstruct a substantial portion of your dwelling. All of these would form what is called a long-term emergency which you need to provide for. Now, any of these requires funding from our end. And the reason we need to provide for is that otherwise you will end up drawing money that is kept for either your children's long-term education or your own retirement, and therefore compromise both those goals, which is why keeping an emergency fund is exceptionally important. Now, the common questions we get asked is, how much should I keep as an emergency fund? The typical rule of thumb that we follow in emergency funding is to provide for anything between 6 and 9 months of one's monthly expenses. As an example, if I'm a family of 4 people, including my EMIs and my daily living, if I'm incurring about $1.5 lakh per month, then anywhere between 9 to 12 lakhs or even 15 lakhs would not be a bad idea to keep somewhere as an emergency fund. This will help you also have a great peace of mind on a day-to-day basis, knowing that in case of any emergency, you have the money that's needed for that. Where should you keep this? Because the name is emergency, should this be in form of cash? The answer is no. There are a variety of routes one can employ to keep these emergency funds. The first and the most basic is to keep monies, at least a certain portion of money, in your savings bank account. I understand savings bank account doesn't give a lot of return, but even at 3%, it's important to keep some amount of money there. And I would ideally urge at least a month's kind of expenses to be kept in your savings account. That will give you great peace of mind in terms of going about your task. And the advantage is you can draw that out any point in time using even your ATM card. So which means that for real emergency where cash is needed instantaneously, you will have access to that money. But anything more than a month, should you hold in a savings account? I think that would be criminal because it's too low a rate of interest. I'd suggest you look at something like a sweep-in FD. What is a sweep-in FD? It's an FD that you create in your bank wherein in case a check is presented or a need is done, the money will automatically sweep from the FD into your savings account so that you can draw it as per your need. That is what we call a sweep-in FD account. So you can keep it in a sweep-in FD account for a period of say 1 year, 18 months, 24 months as per what you think is useful. Some of the people nowadays are also using the liquid funds of mutual funds as a good route to park their emergency. The advantage with liquid fund is that in 24 hours time the money will be in your account and you can access it as per your need. The disadvantage of liquid fund is that if your emergency happens over a weekend, say a Friday night or so, then you'll have to wait till Tuesday morning to get your money because the mutual funds are closed over the weekend, Saturday, Sunday. So there are obvious disadvantages, but a certain portion of your liquid fund, which you may not need instantaneously, can certainly be parked in liquid funds. And they are generating handsome returns now, given that the interest rate is at its peak. So that's one more place one can look at as a parking. But most important, to make sure that whatever be your investments, they are parked in places where they can be easily accessed. That's really the important part of emergency fund. Now let's look at some of the mistakes people make when they use their emergency funds or when they keep their emergency funds. Typically, I have seen people use emergency funds temporarily to replace some of the things that they have in their normal life. Suppose the TV, the 65-inch TV goes conk. I have known clients to pull money from their emergency fund, replace it with the promise that they will come back and refill the emergency fund. That's not a great idea because emergencies are to be used only for emergencies, not for daily life. And replacing a television does not qualify as an emergency. So it's very important that you figure out what your need is. Second, there are people who take the emergency funds which are parked in low return investments and then move it into equity markets or equity mutual funds with the idea of earning a much higher return than what they're getting in the savings account. This again is a bad idea because given that if the market takes a turn for the bad, or let's say the market comes down, then you are forced to sell at a loss, and that compromises your emergency aspect of the funding. So not a good idea to chase high returns, especially when you are dealing with emergency funds. Third, we must also make sure that the emergency funds are informed to close family members as well. It's not just you who's managing everything. What happens if there is an emergency concerning you? How does the family access the emergency fund? That's another thing that one needs to plan for and have in place right and ready. These are all the common mistakes that one needs to kind of take care of managing. Now, how to overcome some of these common mistakes? First up, I think it's a good idea to sit with the family and decide where are the investments and emergency funds going to be invested in and how and under what conditions they are going to be accessed. If this is committed to paper, then it becomes easy for you to take it out only when such an event happens. So for example, you can say, I'm going to park 30% of my emergency funds in savings account. I'm going to park another 30% in a sweep in FD and 40% I'm going to keep it in a liquid fund. And I will only draw this if there is a medical emergency involving a family member, or B, C, D. On these, any of these 1 or 2 or 3 conditions fulfilling is the only time you will access it. This will help you prevent from drawing out in a hurry. Second, you must understand that emergency funds are maintained for liquidity purpose. The primary objective of that investment is to provide liquidity when you need, not returns. So do not compare it with your rest of your portfolio. In fact, I'd suggest you don't even keep it as part of your portfolio. Keep it separate so that you're not tempted to look at comparing returns of your emergency funds with your regular long-term funds. That's another way in which you can manage to keep sanity on leaving your emergency funds without kind of trying to make it work for you. Third, be away from looking at greed playing on the emergency. So there are lots of places where people will tell you it is liquidable quickly. Avoid falling for any of those traps, including lending it to a close family or close friend who promises to return the money in a 15-day or 1-month cycle. Understand that emergency is emergency. Like a parachute, like an emergency product. You never know when you need it, but when you need it, it's a matter of life and death. So be smart about the emergency funds. And if you follow some of these principles, I'm sure you will build a reasonable corpus. The most important part of emergency fund is that it allows you not to disturb your long-term financial plan based investments, thereby helping you compound your wealth over periods of time without disturbance, whereas your emergency funds are always available for short-term needs. That's really the role that emergency funds plays, and I hope you have created your own emergency funds so that the long-term funds can continue to play their roles.